Penguin Random House Audio presents The AfterGrief, Finding Your Way Along the Long Arc of Loss by Hope Edelman. Read for you by Exie Sands. Note to listeners, this program includes a downloadable PDF that contains diagrams from the book. Introduction. Getting over it. A medium once told my sister that our mother was living in a corner of her kitchen. Being our mother's daughters, we took this news in stride. She'd raised us to be open-minded and humble. Who were we to believe we knew better than anyone else? Also, our mother in a kitchen made good sense. Hers had been the nucleus of our childhood home, the place where she'd spent much of her time, standing at the kitchen island, prepping chicken cacciatore in her crock pot, drinking Maxwell House coffee at the speckled formica table with neighborhood friends, sitting at the corner desk and winding the avocado green phone cord around and around her index finger as she settled into a leisurely call. With 3 children and a husband for whom tidiness was forever an abstraction, she was always struggling to keep the space clean. My mother would have loved my sister's kitchen. Mine surrendered to chronic disorder long ago, but my sister's kitchen is always shiny and pristine. I'd choose to hang out there too. My sister and I live across the country from our family's burial plots and rarely get to visit the graves, so she placed a framed black and white photograph of our mother in the corner of her kitchen, between a neat row of mason jars and the countertop range. When I dog sit for her boxers, I give them treats from a jar, and we say hello to my mom. I might let her know that her children and grandchildren are doing fine. If I'm facing a big decision, I'll brush my fingertips across the glass and silently ask her for advice. I have to imagine how she'd answer. We had only 17 years together, and I was pretty much tuning her out for the final 2. I've long since forgotten the sound of her voice and the timbre of her laugh. She died in 1981, and we never made tapes of her talking. In my dreams, she speaks in an unfamiliar pitch. Her words, sometimes garbled, sometimes clear. I haven't heard her real voice in almost 39 years. 39 years. I know. That's a long time, says pretty much everyone ever. 39 years and you're not over it yet? Anyone with major loss in the past knows this question well. We've spent years fielding versions of it, explicit and implied, from parents, siblings, spouses, partners, relatives, colleagues, acquaintances, and friends. We recognize the subtle cues, the slight eyebrow lift, the soft, startled, "Oh, that long ago," from those who wonder how an event so distant can still occupy such precious mental and emotional real estate. Why certain specific nodes are still so tender when poked. How many of us have wondered the same? You're still not over it yet? As if the death of a loved one were a hurdle in a track meet that could be cleared and left behind. I wish there were a foolproof method for getting over the death of someone we love. So much I do. Except everything I've experienced, learned, and observed over the past 38 years has taught me otherwise. Since the publication of my first book, Motherless Daughters, in 1994, I've collected stories from thousands of women in the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Europe, India, and the Middle East whose mothers died when they were young. I've spoken to, emailed, and met with their brothers, husbands, fathers, daughters, and sons. 5 file cabinets in my office are filled to capacity with research into how the human body, intellect, and spirit respond to major loss. In nonfiction writing classrooms for the past 20 years, I've helped graduate students and aspiring writers identify, question, and articulate their stories of trauma and loss. And for this book, I conducted in-depth interviews with 81 men and women who had experienced the deaths of significant loved ones in the past, most of whom were children, adolescents, or young adults at the time, and whose bereavement needs were frequently mismanaged or misunderstood. Because my focus is on living with long-ago loss, with an emphasis on early loss, the majority of my interviewees experienced the death of a parent, sibling, romantic interest, or close friend during childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood. I touch on adult loss of a spouse, partner, or child only briefly throughout, since these are treated as separate and distinct categories in the bereavement literature, and a number of excellent books exist to address their long-term effects. Taken together, that adds up to a staggering number of losses, which is how I can report with assurance that the death of a loved one, especially for someone at a tender age, isn't something most of us get over, get past, put down, or move beyond. That's a myth of diminishment. Instead, a major loss gets folded into our developing identities, where it informs our thoughts, hopes, expectations, behaviors, and fears. We carry it forward into all that follows. It's phenomenal how it never really goes away, says author and therapist Claire Bidwell Smith. It changes shape and form all the time, and comes back in different ways, even when you think it's gone. I'm 24 years out from the death of my mother, and 17 years from the death of my father, and those losses have been with me in some fashion every day since they died. When psychologist Leah Granick and author Megan O'Rourke surveyed nearly 8,000 adults who'd lost a close loved one for Slate magazine in 2011, they observed, in their words, that the alterations of loss are subtly stitched throughout one's ongoing life. Nearly 1/3 of their survey participants had experienced the death of a close loved one 8 or more years earlier. Instead of feeling over it, they wanted to keep talking about how grief had shaped their present-day experiences, and how it might continue to affect their imagined futures. This process is a longer one than most people realize, explains psychologist Robert Niemeyer, a professor of constructivist psychology at the University of Memphis and the founder of the Portland Institute for Loss and Transition. Unfolding over years, rather than months, and involving periodic grief spikes years or even decades later. The Slate survey found the same. 1/4 of the respondents said they'd felt normal only 1 to 2 years after the loss. More than 1/4 said they'd never gone back to feeling like themselves afterward. Nonetheless, when random cross-sections of Americans have been asked how long grief should last after a significant loss, their answers range from several days up to a year. The majority of respondents in one study placed the outer limit at 2 weeks. 2 weeks. In some cultures, that's barely enough time to hold a funeral, let alone put emotional pain into any perspective and start making sense of the loss. A terrible disconnect exists between what the average person thinks grief should look and feel like, typically a series of progressive, time-limited stages that end in a state of closure, and how grief, that artful dodger, actually behaves. This means a whole lot of people getting stuck in the gap between what they've been told to expect after someone dies and what they actually encounter when it happens. An estimated 10 to 15% of bereaved individuals will experience what's known as complicated grief, a state in which a mourner's emotional pain becomes so intense and so persistent that they can't resume daily functioning on their own. It's a bit like the mind getting stuck on the grief channel. Recent research suggests that the majority of these mourners may suffer from pre-existing depression or anxiety, or possess traits that contribute to what's known as a grief-prone personality. Much of the past 70 years' worth of bereavement research has focused on psychiatric patients who suffer from complicated grief, a group that has historically tended to skew female. As a result, much less is known about the other 85%, the population of normative mourners, both female and male, most of whom manage to adapt to their changed circumstances on their own. What comes next for them? What can they reasonably expect to face 10 years later, 20 years, 40? What kind of adjustments do they make over time, which have been most helpful? How do their losses continue to show up throughout their lives? Well, those aren't easy questions to answer. For one thing, grief is a very, very individual process. Any single outcome depends on a long list of variables and the subtle interactions between them. These include the following: one's age at the time of loss, the cause of death, the relationship with the deceased, the amount and type of social support available, gender, temperament, personal worldview, a family's communication style, religion, culture, race, and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, historical period, other stressors at the time and afterward, the management of prior losses, the amount of short and long-term change that occurs in a family system. Those are a lot of variables with a nearly unlimited number of possible outcomes. In addition, very few studies have tracked bereaved individuals.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?